Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be wrapping up the first half of the books that I read in January. I'm sure I will have a smaller wrap up at the end of the month, but today I'm going to be wrapping 16 books and we are only a little bit over halfway done with the month. And so I'm hoping to do a part 2 in this series at the end of the month or at the beginning of February to wrap up all the rest of the books that I read. I am surprised that I read so many books this month. In fact, I read 11 books that are from my physical TBR. Now, a few of these books were easy reads, and I'll get to those in a little bit. So let's just go into the books that I read this month, and somebody's being demanding. So it has been snowing a lot this week, and so this little wigglewort will not go outside and poop. He has been very, very inappropriate. We've had to take him outside a lot, and he'll only go potty under bushes, and he will not walk when his paws are covered with snow. He's the most prissy little boy. Anyway, I digress. Let's get into all the books that I read since the beginning of this month. So the first book I actually DNF'd. I did not continue reading it, and that's Overcoming Life by D.L. Moody. I didn't realize this. I thought this was I believe he's Presbyterian. Don't quote me on that. He's a Christian minister. I thought it was going to be like his life. And it was like a vintage biography, but no, it turns out it's his sermons. And these sermons are the most boring, droll stuff. Okay, I struggle with sermons depending on where they're coming from because they're a little preachy. Literally, I guess, which is weird because I'm Catholic. So I'm used to listening to sermons. It's not like I dislike sermons, but I struggled with these because they were very boring and very preachy, telling me exactly what I should do without telling me why should I do it. And that's what I love about Catholicism is they don't just go to oh, you should do this, 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 and this. They're like, oh, this is why you should do this. So I struggled with this. So I ended up DNFing it. It was like a vintage book that I got from the Goodwill years ago. So I don't feel bad for not enjoying it. Now, the second book I read was The History of Russia by George Vernadsky, and this book was very, very good. I am more familiar with 19th century, especially 19th century, a little bit of 20th century Russia. The War of 1812, I studied in college. I also studied a little bit of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, so the mid-1800s, and then I studied a lot about the Soviet Union. So I was familiar about the recent history of Russia, but it was really interesting to understand how it developed over the centuries, especially the early Middle Ages, because there wasn't that much civilization before the Middle Ages, even though it is mentioned, I believe, in Herodotus, the people that lived in the flats. I can't remember their name. They were mentioned in this book. It was a really good book. It's a dense, dry history, and I have been leaning towards not buying those anymore just because I don't really enjoy dry histories anymore. But I do have a few more on my physical TBR that I have to get through this year, but I won't be purchasing anymore. But this book, for what it was really interesting. And if you are a big fan of Russian history, or you're a big fan of Russia and you don't know much about the history, I would recommend this book. It didn't take me that long to read for being a dense history. And I think it's because the writing is not extremely small. I've read some history books that have extremely small writing, and so I struggle with those. All right, the next book I finished. Oh, and that one I should say I gave 4 out of 5 stars. So obviously the Moody book of sermons I did not rate because I DNF'd it. The next book I finished this month was Wrath by John Gwynne. This is the last book in the Faithful and the Fallen series, which means I've finally completed this epic series. Each of these books are 500 to 700 pages, and I read it because my husband's such a big fan, but I'm glad to be done. This book was incredible. It was a really good ending, but you also felt this little bit of a hangover when you finish it, like I did. And I have this with a few books, but it's usually like longer series where you spend a lot of time with the characters and you feel like you've really gotten to know them. And so this one I felt that with, because there's such a wide array of characters. It's a medieval epic fantasy, not that much heavy on the magic, much more on the like medieval realistic gritty feel, and you follow this vast array of characters as they try to fight this like upcoming evil, this evil that's trying to take over the world. And of course, Corbin is the main character. He's been the main character. In fact, my husband and I did a review for the first book, so I will link that in the description if you're curious to know our thoughts about the first book, because I feel like I can't say much about this book without spoiling all the rest of the books, because this is the fourth book in the series. But I did end up giving it 5 out of 5 stars. I love this book. It's definitely difficult to read because there's so many characters. I've said that about like each book in the series, but I do love it. And I feel like a lot of the endings to the characters, whether they died or not, were very fitting. And so yeah, I cannot speak highly enough about this book. John Gwynne is one of those authors that I really want to read more. His fantasy is just so good. All right, and the next book I read was The Witch of Blackbird Pond by Elizabeth George Spear. So this one follows this young woman. Girl, because she's like a teenager. She comes from Barbados. Her parents have both died, and she lived with her grandfather, and he just recently passed away, and she was losing her estate. So she goes up to the colonies, and this is set in the 1680s, I think. It's about like less than a decade before the Salem witch trials. And she arrives at this like small Puritan town where her aunt lives, they're her last family, so they're the only ones she can go to. And she ends up getting caught into this like hysteria over people being different and thus being accused of witchcraft. And it's really interesting. The biggest like criticism I have for this book is that it is for like middle graders. It feels very youthful, and I thought a lot of the ideas weren't necessarily developed, but I also realized that like if I was reading this at 12 or 13, I would have loved this book. It is so good and so much fun. There's this perfect balance of like history as well as romance, and then mystery, and then the drama having to do with the witchcraft stuff. The main character, Kit, you're always on her side. You always agree with her. And she is this like light of reason in this very Puritan culture. But you don't have like everyone pitted against her. You have a lot of people that are in the middle that maybe sympathize with her or like her, but they aren't strong enough to stand up against this like societal restrictions of the era. So I loved this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Like I said, I would have liked a little bit more development, but I also realize, if you're writing this for a teenager, you're not going to get as much depth. All right, the next read, controversial opinion, A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline Lingo? So this is the first book in a series of, I think, 5 books? I don't know. But this is the only one that I would say became really famous. Like, I've never heard anything of the rest of the series. I saw the movie that was made in like the 90s. And I remember enjoying it as a kid. This is a little bit trippy for my taste. It just felt like a little bit meandering. The main character, Meg, her father was researching this like magical thing. I'm trying to stay out of spoilers. And so one of her friends and her little brother, Charles, get drawn into this world and travel through universes. And it felt very much like Meg was being dragged through the entire adventure with no like action of her own or no thought of like she wasn't progressing the plot, and I really struggle with more passive protagonists. So I think that's why I didn't like this as much as I remember I did when I was a child. Like, maybe I had different tastes as a child. I did end up giving this 3 out of 5 stars, so it's not like I hated it, but I don't see myself continuing this series or wanting to reread it. It's not one of my favorite kids' books, but it was good. It was enjoyable. The adventure itself, the evil, all the scenes, the descriptions of the different worlds, I really enjoyed that. It's very imaginative, but I think I would have preferred it if Meg had felt like a stronger protagonist. And she does become like pushing the narrative at the very end, but by that point I was just so clocked out because she was so passive in the beginning that it couldn't save it for me. But still fun book, and I see why everyone loves it. Then I read 5 books from my physical TBR. These are Great Ages of Man. So I read Ancient China, Ancient America, Ancient Egypt, The Age of Exploration, and The Cradle of Civilization. So most of these, like, I gave these a mix between like 2 to 4 stars. So these were all a little bit all over the place for me. The text and narrative was interesting on all these topics, but I thought like some of them had very like modern like ideas of art, and then they have like all these photographs. The problem with the photographs is they're such low quality, and these books were all published in the 80s, so I understand that the quality of film was not quite as high as it is now. So maybe I'm just used to the higher quality of film, but I enjoyed reading this series, but I didn't love it. But they're all like fun, quick reads. I think I read these all like in one night over a few hour period. And that did mean that I got like 5 extra books off my physical TBR, which is great. All right, the next book actually, this one is not on my Goodreads because it doesn't exist on Goodreads. It's the Hofburg of Vienna. So this is like a tourist pamphlet, and I believe it's either the late 1800s or the early 1900s of the Hofburg of Vienna, this palace that is in Vienna. And so it talks about the history a little bit. It talks a little bit about the architecture. It even has some ads for like, opera guide. So it's really interesting to like see what like types of pamphlets a tourist in Vienna would get, say a century ago. So it's a light read. I would give it probably like 4 out of 5 stars, even though it's not on Goodreads, so technically I can't rate it, but it was a book to get off my physical TBR, so that's a benefit. All right. Oh, another controversial one. Oh my gosh. I feel like this month I read so many books that I have such a controversial opinion on. So this one is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. This is a retelling of the King Arthur story, told very much from inspiration taken from the Thomas Malory Le Morte d'Arthur, which I did read a few years ago, I think when I was in college the first time, not for school, but I read it at that age. So I read it probably like 5 or 6 years ago. So it's been a while. So a lot of the details I didn't have. So this book, this specific book is broken up into 4 parts. There is a 5th part, which the audiobook that I got from the library ended up having. I didn't end up reading that one. And we'll get to that in a minute. So the first book, actually, okay, so the first book is probably the most famous one. It's The Sword and the Stone. So this one is about Merlin's, Arthur's childhood under the tutelage of Merlin. And they also made a Disney movie of this, which I grew up watching. So it's quite strange when I started to read this. I was like, this is very familiar. So it follows Arthur as like a young boy. He is like second. He's like a nobody. And he gets transformed into different animals and has to survive. And Merlin is hilarious. If this book was the only book in this entire book, if The Sword and the Stone was the entire story, 5 out of 5 stars. I love this first one. You can imagine my disappointment when it all went downhill from there. So the second book, though my copy calls it The Queen of Air and Darkness. I can't remember what the other title is, but this one is about the early reign of King Arthur. So you have him being kind of young. At the end of The Sword in the Stone, he obviously pulls the sword out of the stone. Most people know that story. And the second book picks up after he becomes ruler. And so it's a lot about jumping around. We follow like 3 or 4 storylines. You have Gareth and his brothers who eventually become Knights of the Round Table. You have King Arthur. You have this other random knight who was in the first book who's hilarious, but I don't care about him. And so with that one, I would have given it like 3 stars. It jumped around too much from too many different characters, but it wasn't bad. The third book, which for reference is the longest book in The Once and Future King, is The Ill-Made Knight. This one follows Lancelot's story. So Lancelot and Guinevere fall in love. I don't care. I hate them both. And I was just so done with this story. If I hadn't owned a copy of this, I would have like burnt it. And if I didn't love The Sword and the Stone so much, I also would have burnt this book. Oh, no, I wouldn't burn books. I don't burn books, but I hated it with a burning passion. I would give it 1 star. Like, Lancelot is so annoying. Guinevere is a horrible human being, and yet somehow Arthur is able to justify it in his head that his, like, wife is cheating on him with his best friend. And he's just like, oh, I need to, like, hide it for them so that, like, no one catches them because they'll both be executed. Yeah, well, maybe they shouldn't have cheated on you. Anyway, so I hated that story. And then, of course, the last book, The Candle in the Wind, is about the end of King Arthur's life. And about his death. And then at the very end of the book, there is this like meager instant of hope, the candle in the wind itself, that King Arthur's story will live on. And yeah, long story short, the last book I would have given like 2 out of 5 stars. It had too much of Lancelot and Guinevere that I didn't care about, but I did like the ending. So yeah. So altogether, I gave this entire book, The Once and Future King, 3 stars, because I love the first book. The second book was okay. The third book I hated with a burning passion, and the fourth book was bad, but not as bad as the third book. I am so sorry. So many people love this book, and I'm just like sitting here bashing on it. Do you see how cute Loki looks though? Let's forget about this book and admire the cuteness of my dog. Admire the cuteness of the dog. That dog. Let's move on to the next book before I get heated. I almost made like a full review for The Once and Future King, but then I realized I was just too angry. So the next book that I read was the Aeneid by Virgil. This is the Ralph Humphreys translation. This was a good translation. I like this translation. I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars, which you might be like, wait, what? An epic Roman classic? Why would you only give it 3 out of 5 stars? Well, you know what? This book, I'm pretty sure, invented the idea of a fan fiction. Like, Virgil is basically just taken the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer that was written like, 400 years before him in Greece, and saying, oh, I'm Roman. I want to take the story over to my own people, continue on the story, but have it follow the Aeneas, this guy who was a Trojan that fought for Troy against the Greeks in the Iliad, and now he's like journeying home and he's like destined to found Rome. It felt like a cheap fan fiction. Oh my gosh. A controversial opinion, but here's the thing. This book isn't bad. There's quite pretty lines. I enjoyed like the drama of the gods, even though the gods all have the wrong names because, you know, they have the Roman names instead of the Greek names, which I'm a little bit more used to the Greek names than the Roman names. So that kind of threw me off for a little bit. But I also just felt like in every way the Iliad and the Odyssey are better. And I'm like, why would I read this when I could read the Iliad and the Odyssey? And yes, you see a lot of like the interest in Roman stuff that's in this book. And how like Romans basically stole everything from the Greeks and made it their own. But yeah, no, this book I guess it's not a book as much as it's an epic poem. But I did not like this as much. I'm getting so giggly in this video because I do not like ranting about all these like classics. I feel like the more classics I read, the more opinionated I am about them, because I have read more classics now, so I can say, oh, these are better than this one. And that's why, like, if I read the Aeneid first, maybe I would have liked it more. But because I read the Iliad and the Odyssey first, like, I see what that quality of writing can be. And so this one just fell flat to me. It was kind of just boring for most of the book. All right. So the next 4 books I read, I actually already wrapped up in my first week of Around the World in 80 Days. Which are all set in England. So I will link that video down in the description if you want to watch my full thoughts about those books. So I read Curtain by Agatha Christie. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it, but I really think they did dirty to Poirot in the end. The next book I read was Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. It was a great fun adventure, but Ivanhoe was the most boring protagonist in existence. I may be being a bit dramatic, but a great, like, medieval romance adventure. The next book I read was The History of England by W.E. Lunt. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. It was really good history, even though it was a little bit dry. But if you're a big fan of history, and especially the history of England, you'll probably enjoy it. And then the last book that I read for Around the World in 80 Days in England was Utopia by Thomas More. This was a great book. It was an analogy of this ridiculous kingdom that existed. And some of these laws were like crazy, but the whole point is that Thomas More was making fun of this idea of a utopia, how it's not really possible. So yeah, a really good book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. And then the last book I'll be wrapping up in this video. The rest of the books that I finished this month will be wrapped up in the my part 2 of my wrap up. And I also did a dedicated review for this one. It's The Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean M. Auel. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. It was good, but I just don't think this book was for me. I just needed more like rising conflict and then like a resolution, a climax at the end. And it just like remains stagnant for the entire book. So it was a little bit boring to me. So those are all the books that I read kind of a little bit over in the first half of January. I'm curious, have you read any of these books? Do you disagree with me? I would love to hear, like, especially with the classics, if you disagree with me, just to garner, like, did I miss something? Should I, like, reevaluate my perception of these books? I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a great week. Bye.